Hello, everyone. Welcome to another collaboration episode between Baiguan, Pekinology, and eState. My name is Robert Wu. I'm the founder of Baiguan Newsletter. With me is my co-host, Huang of Pekinology, and also a senior fellow at Center for China and Globalization, and Johnny Zhou, the founder of eState Newsletter. So every week, we three try to talk about the most relevant issues and events of the past week about China. So, where should we start this week?
We obviously should start with your guest essay in the New York Times.
Robert?
Well, I don't think there are many Chinese mainland citizens writing in the New York Times opinion pages. You wrote something about the trade war, basically, right?
Yeah, it's quite an amazing and interesting experience, I think. I think it was about 2 weeks ago, someone from New York Times editorial team reached out through mutual friends to me. Basically, I think what they wanted was very interesting, is that they specifically want someone who are based in China who can and who have the courage also to give the opinions on issues. And it just so happened the trade war was going on. I was invited to write about the Chinese perspectives in this trade war. And I think that the process is also it's interesting for me to not only just write the essay, but also get through all the editorial process with the New York Times team. And it's quite an experience because it's actually I would say it's a kind of collaborative project. There's actually a lot of kind of paragraphs or wordings are suggested by the editorial team. And I also made my suggestions, and there are a lot of back and forth. And there's also quite a difficult process because obviously there are still differences in terms of opinions between a mainstream Western media and what I have, right? So there's a lot of reconciliation as well in terms of the difference in our opinions. But I think in the end, what's really make it possible is somehow the rise of Donald Trump and his supporters turned American mainstream media into some kind of alliance with Chinese, so that there's actually a lot of common ground in how we see this whole tariff war or trade war. But yeah, so it's quite amazing. Yeah.
I think it's the New York Times, the number one newspaper in the world, the paper of record, and writing on its opinion pages certainly carries some level of prestige. And I think credit where credit is due. In China, many people keep saying Western mainstream media keeps blaming the Chinese for various different subjects and they are unfair. But they also, at the end of the day, they reach out to you fully aware of the potential views of you on this trade war and invite you to write on their opinion pages. I'm sure like the editing process is quite common for guest essay writers from different locations in the world and with you. But I guess I wouldn't go so far as to say some sort of alliance. But I guess, as you said, the common ground is pretty wide because I think the tariff war and we have more revelations from different American news outlets this week. It's indeed very chaotic. And I guess in many American eyes, it's not in the interests of U.S. leadership. It's not in the interests of American domestic governance. And I think there was a report by Politico very recently talking about how the Treasury Secretary and the head of the Department of the Commerce, they somehow sidelined Mr. Navarro, the senior advisor, and basically got President Trump to backtrack the tariffs across many trading partners. It was quite an enlightening read. And I guess at this stage, it's not as surprising as people would typically assume a few years ago because the lack of coordination like the back and forth within the White House leadership team. And I think most importantly, the uncertainties created for American businesses, for its trading partners, they are indeed very huge.
Yes, yes. And I also find it interesting that in the comment section of my essay on New York Times, there are now, I think, close to 500 comments. And actually, most of the comments, surprisingly, are quite positive for the essay. I didn't actually expect that coming from China and with the very specific Chinese perspective. It was actually pretty well received. So I echo your suggestion. I echo your point that I don't think there's a lot of the inherent bias. It just takes a lot of people to reach out to the other side and talk more, and for both to have more courage to share and exchange. Basically, there's a lot that we can do to bridge the gap in terms of understanding, in terms of at least acknowledging or understanding the other side's viewpoints. Yeah.
Yeah,
Not trying to be cynical here. I just feel like because the title is Eating Bitterness, I guess the most Americans are not good at eating bitterness. So they feel you a lot, right? That's why you guys are in the same trench right now. They don't want to eat bitterness. But once this thing is all over, then it's a totally different story.
I think China fired back with more developments. We've seen reports about Beijing canceling or delaying or suspending Chinese airlines, Chinese state-run airlines order from Boeing. And there are other reports about basically President Trump is maybe reportedly trying to tell its allies that one of the preconditions they would get a deal with China, with the Trump administration, is to join their fight to encircle China from the trade perspective. Johnny, you work in investments. Do you have any takeaways for us?
Yeah, I feel like the Boeing thing is more of like a pressure cooker, right? I think it's a tactic from the Beijing side trying to get the US back to the negotiation table. I think all of the developments in the past 2 weeks, if you look at what's going on, is two things. One is the US government is trying its best to get the Chinese counterparts back to the negotiation table. But the way they are doing it is through adding the tariff rates. But on the other hand, the Chinese sort of tactic is to get the US business community to get to their senses. And Boeing, obviously, they have China as one of the largest customers, to get to their senses and to pressure them, right? But Boeing is just one example. Another interesting person came to Beijing without his leather jacket. And he's weirdly in his suits. And that has raised a lot of eyebrows here in China. And I think that's the tactic by the Chinese side, is to talk to the US business community and make them understand that the current situation is going to hurt them massively. And Jensen Huang's visit is just another interesting example.
Yeah, the Jensen Huang visit was really very interesting because he came immediately after Trump administration basically effectively banned Nvidia from exporting H20 chips. Do you think this is a kind of a political gesture by Jensen Huang to just shit on Trump's base through this visit? Do you guys think that's the case?
Just to be fair to Jensen Huang, who I had the privilege of totally accidentally running into in September 2023, I was visiting a major US think tank and I just ran into him and he was in his leather jacket. But I think when he showed up in Mar-a-Lago not long ago, he was actually wearing a proper suit. And so I think before the BIS at Commerce Department slapped export control on the H20 chips, which is, for listeners who are not very familiar, is basically the sort of chip that Nvidia specifically designed for the Chinese market, which is downgraded from its best offerings, so that Nvidia would comply with existing export control rules. But, there were always talks on the US side about even banning that. Jensen Huang went to Lago, according to US media reports, paid pretty good money for a dinner or for a meal with the president. And that H-20 export control was, I think, delayed. But as you said, this week, the BIS at Bureau of Industrial Security at the Commerce Department, they imposed the new controls, and very soon after that, Jensen Huang showed up in Beijing. And one thing that has caught the eyes of the observers of Chinese politics is that Jensen met not just the vice premier and a member of the political bureau He Lifeng in China, who is very senior official on the Chinese side, but during the meeting, gathered various deputy ministers from across Chinese ministries, including Foreign Ministry, Commerce Ministry, I think even the Cyberspace Administration of China, also key ministries. They were at a large room with a large conference table, and it's not the sort of typical visit by a multinational corporation CEO with a senior Chinese leader, but it even looked like some sort of quasi-official exchanges between a Chinese government. And typically, in most cases, on the other side of the conference table would be like a proper government delegation team. So there are totally unsubstantiated rumors that maybe Jensen Huang is some sort of go-between. I don't know. If that's the case, it would be really weird, because the company is caught in between. I think Nvidia is the best example of being caught in between China and the United States in this escalating science competition, technology competition. But on the other hand, China is a major market for Nvidia. Yeah, so that's actually very interesting, because since President Trump signaled quite frequently in recent weeks that there is no proper communications between the two sides, so people were speculating who could be the channel of track 2 or track 1.5 diplomacy. Is there anybody running the back channel? So again, this is like totally unsubstantiated speculation and rumor on Chinese social media. But Jensen Huang was received in a very formal manner and in a very unusual manner. That's indeed interesting, at least in my perspective.
That's an interesting theory. I have actually not thought about this. What do you think is the likelihood for that? Do you think it's like a far-fetched idea, or there's actually a strong probability of him being this go-between?
I don't know. I used to be a professional journalist. I like to base my speculations on facts. And so he is or he is
Well,
not.
it makes sense. No, but it makes sense, because after all, if that's not the case, then he's basically showing his middle finger to Trump, right? Just immediately after that, he came to China, seemingly not afraid of any political retribution. Yeah, interesting theory. I'll keep that in mind.
What do you think, Johnny?
To a certain extent, I feel that Jensen is probably the one who doesn't have the leverage in all of the game right now. The reason being is that if you look at the bigger picture, within the Magnificent Seven, there are several gigantic companies that do very little business in China, but there are ones that do significant portion of their business in China. And so it's not too surprising that they got welcomed here. But this visit is indeed quite substantial, in that the H-20 chip just got banned. And so I think it's more of a working nature, in that they're trying to figure out a substitution or an alternative plan get around the H-20. But if, let's say, he's really the back channel, the real question is, what is the U.S. government trying to get? Because when I see the whole thing right now, the Treasury Secretary seems to be in the driver's seat right now. But he has very little sort of indication that he wants to reach any deal with the Chinese at the current standpoint. In the contrary, I think some of the US officials are even more hawkish. And there's also little room to believe that they will hold a substantial sort of discussion with the Chinese side. So that is something that really confuses me if he is the back channel. But you don't know. This administration is really out of whack. So it doesn't surprise me if anything happened, and including that he is the back channel.
And I think Trump also said that he would expect to reach a deal with the Chinese within a month of their differences. And it has reached a certain stage that even I'm not at a loss with all these news reports depicting the behind scenes back and forth in the administration. And I think there is one other subject is the USTR, the US Trade Representative, finally released their sort of a conclusion of their investigation into the shipbuilding industry in China, where they accuse the Chinese of using various market distortion measures so that they would apply some punitive measures. But the published rules, which is still under public consultation stage, seems to be a walk back from the initial suggestion, so that shipping companies would still have to shoulder some more costs, especially in the long run when it comes to use Chinese-built ships, containers to conduct maritime commerce to the United States. But it's not as bad as anticipated quite a while ago. But of course, like from the Beijing side, this is not well received at all. And the Commerce Ministry, China, MOFCOM, has said China will basically retaliate, but the retaliations hasn't been specified. I think like there were a lot of discussions here in the United States, where I'm currently in, about trying to ramp up the U.S. shipbuilding, because apparently the shipbuilding capacity and record of the United States has lagged so far behind China, and so to the point that many in Washington, D.C. believe this is not just let's say, an industry problem, it's a strategic problem, because shipbuilding also relates to Navy forces development. So this is another friction point between the two big powers.
Yeah, what do you think of the earlier Bloomberg story of basically the China side is ready to talk, but then China would want the US to appoint someone to talk to, and also want the US side to ring in the kind of anti-China rhetoric? I will assume they was referring to J.D. Vance peasant talk. So there was this story from Bloomberg about that. What do you guys think of the story?
I think the news is in Beijing, there is a new ministerial level official appointed at MOFCOM, although he has been appointed as the deputy minister of MOFCOM, but he is at the ministerial rank, and he would be in charge of the negotiations, not with the U.S. specifically, towards other countries. And I'm not exactly sure that has anything specific to do with U.S.-China talks. And I think like Bloomberg, I think they put this, which is legitimately a news, with China-US talks. I haven't read into why there is such a link. And on what you just mentioned, that China wants the US to have a designated negotiator, I think that's fair. And that's therefore you want people to talk to who really matter, who really have a direct link with President Trump, who has Trump's ears, all these issues. But I think like one of the major, let's say the number one preconditions from the Chinese side is, I would guess, some sort of suspension of at least like a big chunk of the 145% tariffs, or maybe the new tariffs imposed.
Yeah,
or the new tariffs imposed after the Liberation Day tariffs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what Zichun just raised is an important point, is that China actually changed its chief trade representative. Previously, it was actually a very core member of the sort of Trump 1 trade negotiation. But this time, the change to Chen Gang, who's more like a master in terms of WTO, as well as towards the EU type of trade sort of relations, is actually not a very optimistic showing by the China side towards the sort of US-China trade talks. It means that China is thinking about more referring to global framework. It's thinking of more breakthrough with the EU, and maybe they are totally prepared that the US-China trade talk will completely collapse. And maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think the change is not a very good signal towards the US side, who currently is just want to get this deal done. But I just don't feel that the Chinese side has the appetite right now, unless the entire Liberation Day rhetoric is being dialed back.
I agree. I definitely agree that the US have to go back before the L Day for China to start talking. But then again, that will be a huge slap in the face of Trump, right? So I think it's just going to be a deadlock over there.
Let's hope like they are all very skilled business people, at least they out of the deal, and also, of course, very good politicians and diplomats. If they could find some sort of, I don't know, some sort of like declaration to just go down the ladder a little bit and lower the temperature and allow some room for talks. And oh God, let's change some subject, right? It's too much is focused on this. What are the like other developments that you think? For example, I think in China there has long been this talk of, especially the business community's complaint about certain police departments of local regions trying to use minor, I don't know, accusations to nab entrepreneurs and business people and even extort money from these companies because the local government finances haven't been very good. But there are some recent developments which I think really matter for the Chinese private business community. Is there is a concerted effort out of the central government to rein in this rent-seeking law enforcement, and the Ministry of Public Security, which is main police force in China, has apparently published, at least circulated internally within the police forces, a new regulation basically telling the police force in all the Chinese provinces and the municipalities to refrain from harassing and interfering with business operations in Chinese companies. And the Supreme People's, let's say, prosecutor's office also set up a dedicated zone where basically the Chinese businesses, I guess that also includes foreign businesses in China, to file complaints with the prosecutor's office in case they encounter such rent-seeking enforcement from China's police forces. And this has been underreported, I think even underreported in China.
Yeah, I think it was just today that the document that you mentioned by the Ministry of Public Security was circulated among the WeChat groups that I saw. And it was also shared by many lawyers. It looks pretty real because when you search for this document, although there was not official announcement of this document, you can see that certain police forces in certain counties or cities are actively learning and studying from this document. And but when you check this, I think there was a development over the last several months about this. I think I remember by the end of last year, there were already official recognition of this problem. Some people call it high sea fishing or deep sea fishing. Basically, yeah, as you mentioned, this is really targeting companies in other provinces with some minor infringement. So I think right now, if you look what happened over the last several months, there was just like escalation of attention to this problem, right? And what's interesting is that this internal document that we were talking about, if you look at the date, it was actually came into effect on March the 5th, which was about a month ago, and which was actually about 2 weeks, right after that very important symposium between the top leadership and the private businesses that everyone was talking about at the time. So it does seem that symposium, and that symposium also mentioned things related to these kind of law enforcement problems, right? So it does seem the spirit of these high-level discussions and events are actually going into actual practice and making real changes. I don't think we need to go through the details of the policy. My impression as a private businessman myself, when I read that document, my impression is they are really effectively basically outlawing this high sea fishing practice. I think this document is very targeted, it's very specific. It basically make the previous kind of malpractice in this area impossible to do later. So I'm pretty encouraged by this development.
Let's just high sea fishing. That's the term Robert just used. That's the Chinese domestic metaphor, because one the police force in a county, one province could travel 1,000 miles away to complete province and just arrest business people and bring them back to their home county in a different province. And the Chinese people domestically call that high sea fishing, just to have fishing boats traveling across the ocean and to fish in different places. I think the term itself speaks of the tremendous damage and the reckless nature of such practices. Johnny, you are a very senior investor at one of China's best-known investment funds. I hope that's good news for your companies, huh?
It's a bit too late. I think over the last 5 to 8 years, we've seen way too many cases that are a bit, you would call it out of whack. So I think this thing is a little bit sad from my perspective, is that it should be common sense type of thing, but it's only through the central government, like the top leadership signaling, that it could really become law enforcement item. But the thing is, now you remove the negative sort of incentive, but that doesn't mean that people are incentivized to do business. You need to have more positive incentives to do business. And that is one. The second thing, I think most of our foreign listeners who probably don't have a sense of, is actually in China, local governments differ by a lot. There are some local governments that are very progressive, very pro-business. They could protect private entrepreneurs, even before such sort of law enforcement notice has really been put out. But there are governments that even with this notice, they will still do something that is out of whack. Maybe not like a high sea fishing, but there are some other ways they could do some punitive actions towards entrepreneurs. So unfortunately, that's the case. So the local governments really differ a lot in China.
Yeah, just to give some background, there are like over 30 provincial level governments in China, and under each provincial government, there are like, I guess, usually a dozen municipal or city level governments. And under that, there are like, for each city, there are like, I don't know, a dozen or half a dozen county level governments in China. And surprisingly to many in the West is that they sometimes really act on their own, especially when it comes to economic and commerce and law enforcement, and they have a lot of discretion. That's some China studies scholars have long labeled as some sort of Chinese federalism, where the fragmentation of power between different levels of the Chinese state operators much wider than outsiders typically presume. And I guess we have talked about, I don't know, half an hour, maybe over half an hour. I think there is something else, which is the Chinese president has finally wrapped up his visit to Southeast Asia to 3 countries, including Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia. And it's the first visit overseas by the Chinese president in the year of 2025. And I think partly due to the trade war, many people are paying a lot of attention to see what are the latest Chinese moves to basically to strengthen its common ground with its neighbors And Southeast Asia, in terms of global commerce, is rising rapidly and very important. What do you see there?
Yeah, I think the timing is certainly very interesting. But do you think this kind of visit was, I bet this kind of visit was pre-decided already, right? Even before the trade war. The Chen, do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think so. Like the Chinese don't plan their visit, especially at this level, official visits, which, as you can see from the photos, from the footages, are highly, let's say, the three Southeast Asian countries made very big preparations to receive the Chinese president. So it mustn't was planned at the 11th hour, or let's say 3 days or 5 days or a week in advance. That's definitely not the case, although we are outsiders, celebrities. And one thing that I think is something very, it seems very technical, but I believe it's these sort of technicalities that show real convergence of intentions and of actions. Is in China uses some certain of real track, and the real track don't match the real tracks of its neighbors. I think it comes to that's true with some Central Asian neighbors of China, with the Russians, and also with the Southeast Asian countries that have land borders with China. But one thing that was reported and came out of the sort of joint statements between China and Vietnam is that they will use the same rail tracks, so that when trains carrying goods, carrying people travel from China to Vietnam or from the other way around, you don't need to change track at the border. And I think this is something very technical and very small. People typically don't pay attention. But this, from a practical point of view, from a logistics, that saves a lot of trouble. And it also sends some sort of signal, like the two countries are on the same track now. And even though the specific English language word would be the same. And that's something I saw.
Yeah, I was today I'm actually at Canton Fair in Guangzhou, and I'm just paying a visit and see for myself what is going on right now in the context of trade war. And one thing that's really striking me is a lot of the booths I went to, a lot of these Chinese companies, exporters, they are posting pictures of their Vietnamese factories. A lot of these companies are boasting that they are both Chinese and Vietnamese, or their chairman is some kind of vice president of Chamber of Commerce in Vietnam or something. I think it's inevitable that it's going to be a huge kind of integration project between China and Vietnam. And it's a mutually beneficial relationship. China would want some place that will be less targeted by the US. And then Vietnam also, I think they really want to develop, right? They really want to have the same kind of growth that China enjoyed in the last 2 decades. So I think there's just historically inevitable for this bond to get stronger and stronger. Johnny, do you have any final comments on this?
I think the real network thing is really because the China-Laos and the China-Laos-Thailand railway is already under construction. And I think even under significant delays, it is supposed to be finished by 2027 to 2028, which means that from the Yunnan province of China, you can get straight to, say, Bangkok, right? And that's a huge thing for the China-ASEAN relationship. And so for China-Vietnamese sort of network, previously it has been delayed because of the Vietnamese government has undergone some change over the last 2 to 3 years, especially a leadership change. There's been huge corruption cases. There's also the trade war, as well as Vietnamese government, from historical reasons, has a bit of a cautious approach towards developing an overheated relationship with China. But I guess now they have to do some catch up because it's just the speed is just too fast. And without this railway, without this network, Vietnam could be easily cut behind in terms of overall China-ASEAN sort of relationship. And China can just go through the network that they are already built And that's certainly not a very good news for the Vietnamese economy, especially under a global trade blockade that we're talking about. I would say it's more of a catch up, but this certainly has been a little bit spinned or a little bit affected by the US Liberation Day tariff, where they also singled out Vietnam as having a higher tariff rate initially than China. And so what China is trying to do here is also trying to comfort the Vietnamese counterparts as well.
Yeah, I think that's it. Let me highlight something I just published. I was talking to Hubo, the director of South China Sea Probing Initiative, Chinese think tank, about he is a leading expert on South China Sea and all these activities over there. If you have some time, you're welcome to check my latest podcast with Hubo over there. And I think it's quite rare for Chinese academics and analysts to speak in a podcast in English, which is directly available for the international audience, and really speak a lot. And when it comes to news, and yeah, check it out if you have the time.
Great. So maybe that's it for this week.
Let's look forward to the next one. It's going to be great.
Great. Okay.
Okay.
Go on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.